There were a couple of lectures, for example, on migration or the ice age, biogeography, or also if we think of the lecture on extinctions and biodiversity loss. These lectures did not really contain like drawings or any of those charts that would include explanation of processes. These instead would usually contain just a couple of lists of factors. So, what helps animals to navigate, or if we think of what causes biodiversity loss. Other than that, mostly these were about kind of examples of different groups or types of animal species. Possum, for example. Why are there some animals like invaders? So here instead, I just want to concentrate on a few points that are linked to what we said were R and K selected species. So what is this R and K continuum? How can we think about this? And there was a chart here which was about population size. I put here P, population size, and then there was time, more or less usual in our kind of chart here. And we said that there are going to be R and K selected kind of species. And one of the things I just want to clarify what this was about is that there's like a carrying capacity, which is a kind of a volume or the number of population or individuals in a population that would be actually be supported by this specific area. So that is a carrying capacity. How many individuals are able to survive in this specific area with specific abundance of resources. So for example, food. How much food do we have? That would be enough for how many individuals? So that is the carrying capacity. And we said that there are going to be two different like strategies. And the first one we could say is the more simple one, which is the R selected. So these can be things like mosquitoes. I just put here a mosquito then, or something like that. A tiny insect. R selected. How do these live? How are they going to have offspring and so on? Well, once they appear somewhere, their size in population will very quickly grow. And once they reach a certain kind of maximum, suddenly, because they overstep this carrying capacity drastically, so we see that their population size is much larger than what the actual habitat area would support in terms of resources, then very quickly their number would drop. And this will be around a kind of equilibrium, which is around the kind of carrying capacity moving up and down. And there won't be much of like a kind of rationality or a kind of regularity in reaching a steady volume. So it's always going to be crossing the carrying capacity above and below this volume. The population size will be changing. And instead of this more like naive type, I would say that we can think of the case selective species. Let me just put here an elephant. So just to draw an elephant in very simple ways. There, the big ear. So this is then the elephant. This is a case-selected species. And in this case, the number of the individuals in the population would be very close to the carrying capacity, would be something that would very slowly grow. So that's why this curve here is different compared to the one of the R selected. And here it will be nearing and around, moving very close to the carrying capacity. Sometimes perhaps it would go above it, but there will be no very significant drops in the population, so there won't be elephants completely disappearing from an area and then reappearing again. There will be a kind of steady near carrying capacity number of individuals in this population. So how are then the R-selected species going to live their life? Often they just have as many offspring as possible. That's why we have this very quick and fast growth rate. Once there is abundant food or water where they can at all multiply in numbers, they will very, very quickly grow in population size. But once they reach this point, or for example there's a drought, there's not much water again available, then their numbers will be decreasing very quickly. Usually then again their strategy is about spreading or having as many offspring as possible. If we think about plants, like grass or fireweed we're talking about, so they would be very quickly spreading their seeds in large quantities, and these would be blown by the wind. There's not much of parental care if we think of animals. Instead, case-selected species would have a very few offspring. So elephants could have how many babies, how many new elephants? Only one at a time, and only one every couple of years perhaps. So that's why we'd say that they would need to take care of that individual. That's why we don't see this kind of boom, very quick growth in population numbers. So there's parental care, for example. If we think of trees or climate species as well, so case-selected species are often going to be what we find as the climate species. They will be more less tolerant, and they would be also in terms of seeds more like the kind of serotinous species that would need specific conditions such as a forest fire so that they can germinate, they can spread their seeds at all. So that is just how to understand this kind of difference in R and K selected species, just to explain this little chart once again. And now I'm going to pop forward a little bit and start speaking about soils. We're going to discuss soils more in details next week as well. So this is kind of an introduction. But what we can start with is soil horizons. So we said that there will be different soil horizons. Here is what I would say is the surface in this case, and right under the surface we'd find the kind of a horizon, which is the topsoil. Below this topsoil we would have the B horizon, which is the subsoil in other ways. Under that we'd find C horizon, which is actually the regolith. And below the regolith we would find our horizon with the bedrock. So what is the difference and what can be tricky? The regolith here starts with R, and there's an R horizon, but they are not the same, so we shouldn't mix them up. C is the regolith, which is based on the bedrock, which is like rock material such as granite that would go through some kind of chemical weathering, but the structure of the material does not really change. There is not much of other like soil forming processes going on here that would be found in the subsoil in the B horizon mainly. So the regolith is just a kind of structure, kind of like loess we can imagine. So weathered material that still has the structure or the shape of the bedrock itself. What we will talk about more in details in next week's revisions is mainly linked to the B horizon, the subsoil. This is where most of like elevation or puzzleization or fertilization, so some of these processes that are so important, including leaching as well. So these would be mostly linked to the B horizon, where soil forming processes will make certain materials migrate. And then the topsoil is kind of a mixture of this humus layer as well as some of the like rock material that is what originally was the bedrock and the regolith as well. So that's a kind of like mixture, just to put it in very simple terms. And if we think of how this actually would look like, the surface would not actually be right here because we would have a kind of organic layer. So that would be an O horizon above the A horizon. It's going to be relatively thin, very thin often. And so this organic O horizon, which is on the very top, would be built up of 3 layers, which I just expand more details over here. So the O horizon is built up of the H horizon, which is the humus layer. There will be also obviously F layer above that and L layer. Now the L is from litter or the leaf litter material. The F is the fermentation. And below that will be the humus. How can we then relate these to each other? So the litter is basically if we have like dry leaves that have fallen from like the trees. These will, in kind of a dry or half like rotten form, make this kind of litter layer that we can to some extent already imagine as part of the soil layer. When this actually goes through compostation and goes through rotting, then we can call it the fermentation layer, when it's actually rotting and turning into humus. So that's why these are built on one another. By time the litter itself will go through fermentation and become humus, and perhaps become mixed into the topsoil and mixed into the subsoil to some extent as well. So that's why this O, or organic, horizon is going to be built up of these three layers. Now this was a question in one of the exam papers I gave you, and maybe in the answer it was not correct because it was not put in order actually. So this is then the correct order or the correct solution to such a question in the exam.